Hi everyone. We're going to have a go at some online teaching here now. So what I'm going to do is pick up at the point where we left off in our last class face-to-face, which was we'd finish looking at forage in the form of hay and silage and other things we use in practice, such as alfalfa or haylage. So you can have a look back over that. Then the next thing I want to talk a little bit about today is water and how we provide it to our patients in practice. I've one or two odds and ends to mention in the line of bran and so on. And then I'm going to move on to talk about concentrate feeding, because that's something you'll find yourself having to give to your patients as well. So looking at water, first of all, we intuitively know that animals all need access to fresh, clean water. Once we domesticate an animal, we have to provide them with a source of water that meets their needs. And then once we hospitalize an animal, we may have to go to greater lengths than normal to give them access to water. If, for example, they're less mobile than normal, or they have trouble getting up and down, or they have a painful mouth condition, or something is affecting their swallowing, or lots of other reasons. If they're in pain, for example, maybe less inclined to drink water than normal. So it's important that we encourage them to maintain a normal intake and keep them hydrated, and that reduces the need to put them onto intravenous fluid therapy. So looking at animals that are kept outdoors, they'll normally drink from either natural water resources like rivers, streams or ponds, but we've got to be careful that, first of all, they're accessible to the animal. They can actually physically reach them, that the water is fresh and pollution free. It must be available all year round. So for example, it doesn't freeze over in the winter or dry up in the summer. We've got to remember as well that we don't want to pollute or contaminate the water resource by allowing animals unlimited access to it. And we're conscious of the need to avoid them contracting some waterborne parasites, for example. So while this sounds straightforward, there's kind of a lot of things to consider. In reality, most of our animals that are kept outdoors in Ireland are given an artificial water source, usually in the form of trough. Again, you might find yourself looking after troughs in your hospital paddocks. There's a variety of types on the market. Traditionally, they were made of concrete, which are very durable, but very heavy. Once they're in place, they're difficult to move. Metal is another popular choice, but must be well maintained to provide reduce injury from sharp edges. And then plastic troughs are increasingly popular. They last a long time if they're well maintained, they're easy to clean, and they're not as heavy. Regardless of what type of trough you use, you've got to think about attaching them to a secure water supply. So for example, you're going to have some pipes connecting the trough to the water supply, and those pipes need to be deep enough buried that they're not going to be stood on or damaged by the animals, and they must also be deep enough in the ground that they won't readily freeze in the wintertime if there's frost. We also need to check the trough regularly. They normally automatically refill themselves when the animal drinks, but we have to make sure that function continues to work. So it's important they're inspected daily if the animal is using the field, and they should be cleaned out regularly. That can be anything from every 6 months if they're in a part of the field where they're not contaminated, to weekly if they're getting full up with, say, leaves in the autumn time, for example. We also want to avoid having them under trees where they get filled with leaves more easily, and not have them contaminated by lots of mud around them. That animals may tend to congregate there and plough up the ground, so that can lead to problems if they're standing in mud. It also tells you that the pipe leading into the trough may be leaking, so you need to repair it. We don't want to be wasting water out into the ground and creating a swamp around the trough. And also it's important to check the troughs, they're not damaged, that there's no sharp edges on them that can injure the animals, that they're not leaking and so on. This is a picture of a traditional metal water trough, and you can see that there's a pipe leading into it here, which is buried in the ground. It's a good idea, if you look at this particular model, that piece of pipe leading from the ground to the ball cock in the trough isn't insulated. So if you got very cold weather, for example, that piece might freeze and then the trough would no longer fill. I like the fact that it's raised up though, that's helpful. It's easier for the animals to drink, and it also is easier to inspect the base of the trough for any damage. And then this metal cover here at the end is covering the ball cock. That's the valve that allows the trough to refill when the animal drinks, but then stops the trough overflowing. So once the water reaches the designated point, usually a couple of inches below the edges, the ball cock closes the valve and stops the water continuing to enter. If you listen to an animal drinking from a trough, as soon as the water drops, you should hear water start to flow into the trough, and then it should turn itself off when the level gets back to the original height, and that indicates to you that the ball cock is working properly. If it's not, you need to get it checked out. In relation to paddocks at hospitals, we'll often have small sections of pasture where we can turn animals out. Obviously, if the animal is out there, they need to have access to water. So you may have troughs that you can just keep an eye on, or you may have to physically provide the animal with a bucket of water. Whatever method you use, it's important that the water is clean and fresh. There's no point giving the animal medication to treat it and then having it drink dirty or contaminated water while it's under our care. So you can see in this hospital paddock here, there's a plastic container for water here inside the fence beside the gate, and the staff will top that up when the animal is out there using the paddock. There you go. Once we house animals, we need to make sure that they all have access to water. On a farm, they're often kept in groups, so we must have enough water sources for them all to drink as much as they need to. It's preferable to have several sources rather than just one large trough. That reduces competition or bullying when the animals are trying to drink. And it also means that if one stops working temporarily, they still have access to water. We've mentioned keeping them clean. And then, like a trough outdoors, it's important that our fittings are well maintained, that the pipes are insulated so they don't freeze, and we're not wasting water or making beds and floors wet and slippery. So if we think about animals in a veterinary practice, then we'll normally have them in individual pens. It's important that they have their own water supply. And there's two main ways we can do that. We can either use automatic drinkers or buckets. Drinkers are handy in that they reduce the amount of work for staff because they'll automatically refill themselves, but we may not know how much the animal is drinking, which can be useful information at times. And you still have to clean them and maintain them. Buckets are more labour intensive, but we do know how much the animal is drinking by monitoring how often we have to refill them, for example. So there's pluses and minuses for both types of them. The other thing to bear in mind is that some animals may not be used to automatic drinkers. If they have to operate them with their lips to get them to fill, they may not be aware of how to do that. So you have to check that your patient is able to drink from the drinker, and also they're able to reach it. If they have neck pain, for example, and they're reluctant to move their head, they may be reluctant to drink from either a bucket low on the ground or a drinker at chest height. It's important to check that they can reach the water you've provided for them. Having them at a height is also useful. It reduces contamination. You get less dust and dirt and droppings and bedding in them if they're, say, at waist height rather than at floor level. That said, some animals still seem to be able to contaminate them no matter where they are. So it is important that they're checked daily. And then it's very helpful if we can remove the water supply or the water container for cleaning and disinfection. It's more difficult to adequately disinfect built-in drinkers, for example, if the animal had a potentially zoonotic or transmissible disease and we're trying to disinfect and clean the pen after they're discharged. So it depends on the circumstances that you find yourself in. This is just an example of one type of automatic drinker. This one has a plate at the back. It's that D-shaped structure with the hole in it. When the animal presses that with its nose or its lips, the water enters the drinker and fills it. And then when you release the pressure on the plate, the water flow stops. So it's a good idea to ensure these are filled when you put the animal into the pen. So you press the plate yourself with your hand, let it fill, and then they know that's where to get water from. They need to be cleaned and checked daily. These are about maybe 10 inches long and 8 inches deep, so they fit the animal's muzzle into it. So they're not that big. That said, very small animals might not be able to reach them. So it's important to make sure that you have an alternative if the animal isn't able to reach the drinker. And from our point of view, they're handy in terms of reduced pulling and dragging with water buckets, but we don't know how much the animal is drinking on a daily basis. Buckets, on the other hand, they're cheap and cheerful. They are a lot more work, but they do ensure that all animals can generally reach them. We can position them for each individual patient's need. They're easier to keep clean if they're slightly raised off the ground, but where possible, secure them into the corner of the pen so the animal can't knock them over and wet their bed or waste the water. Sometimes you can put them onto a hook on the wall, or you can place them into an old car tire or a specially designed holder to prevent the animal from throwing them over. The handles are important as well. They need to be good quality so they're not going to get caught on the animal's head or head collar. And if in doubt, you're as well to take the handle off if there's any chance the animal getting tangled up in it, because that's obviously going to frighten them. In terms of convenience, they allow us to know how much the animal is drinking. We can take them out to clean and disinfect the pen very easily. but they are more work. So it depends again on our goal for each patient and what we're prioritising in relation to water intake. You can also use containers like this. This is an example of a plastic garden bin. This one has handles, which makes it easy to move it around. When it's full, it's quite heavy. So you can put these containers into the stable and then fill them with buckets or hoses, so you don't have to try and transport a very heavy container around the place. But it does reduce the frequency at which you have to refill the container. So that's quite common as well. People may use half plastic barrels, for example, with the sharp edges sanded off. They'll put that into the stable. They'll fill it from a bucket or a hose. And then when the animal goes home, you can empty it out, wash it, clean it, disinfect it easily, and do the same with the stable and then put it back in, ready for the next patient. So there's a variety of ways you can achieve this. In terms of caring for them, we need to clean buckets and drinkers every day. So every patient gets its accommodation cleaned out daily. Part of that routine involves emptying the drinker, wipe it out, make sure it's free from contamination, and it's either refilling itself correctly or we're filling it with a bucket or a hose. When the animal is discharged, we'll normally disinfect the bucket or the drinker along with the patient pen or accommodation. It's important to bear in mind when we're doing that, we don't use a disinfectant with a strong taste or odor on it. So for example, avoid using undiluted bleach in patient buckets or drinkers, because a very strong smell of bleach can put them off drinking from it afterwards. If you imagine, say, drinking tea from a mug that had bleach in it, it's quite unpleasant. You wouldn't be inclined to do it. If you have neonates, so say calves or foals or lambs, obviously they'll drink from their mother if they're able to, but they do still need access to water and they will sometimes drink it. So it's very important to make sure they can also access the water in the pen. A lot of these animals are reluctant to put their head into a dark bucket, especially if it covers their eyes. So use either a shallow basin or a pale coloured bucket like a yellow one. You'll find them more inclined to drink from that. And also make sure their heads are smaller, and it's easier for a foal or a calf to get their head stuck between the handle of the bucket and the brim. So my advice is to take the handles off buckets if you're leaving them in pens, particularly with large animal neonates. And this is a fella drinking from a pool. Healthy animals will drink water wherever they access it, but for a lot of our patients, they can't or won't do that, and it's important that we have a way of encouraging them to drink. So how much will they drink? The rule of thumb is 50 mils per kilo per day. That's a useful figure to have in your head. Now, some of that will be obtained from the food. If the animal is drinking a very moist diet, they'll drink less water than if they're on a dry diet. We kind of intuitively know that. However, that 50 mils per kilo per day is only a guideline. If they're pregnant or lactating, they'll drink more. If it's a very hot or dry day, they'll drink more. If their diet is dry, they'll drink more. So we have to see that 50 mils per k as kind of an average intake, but we'll often have to provide more water than that for individual patients. And the other thing to bear in mind is that most animals drink several times a day. They don't just have one big drink every 24 hours. They'll normally drink periodically, so it's important that they have water at all times, unless your vet has specifically indicated a reason to restrict their water intake, which is quite unusual. You'll find as well that sometimes animals that we want to drink won't drink, so we'll offer them liquid, and let's say the patient is dehydrated and we want them to drink it, they often won't because of illness or injury. So we've got to keep that in mind as well. It's important for us to notice if a patient's intake is reduced or has stopped altogether, so we can make provision to keep them hydrated by a different means. So if you take an animal, this is a mare and foal. Let's say the foal is hospitalized for treatment, but the mare is healthy. So she's not your patient, but you are responsible for her care. You've got to think about how much water will she drink. So if we take it that this mare weighs 400 kilograms, that would be fairly typical for a mare of this type. And we know that on average, she'll drink 50 mils per kilo per day. In this case, I'm going to use 60 mils per kilo per day to allow for hot weather or dry food. You can see from the photo previously that she's in a straw-bedded stable with hay in the rack behind her. So we'll assume 60 mils per kilo per day. That works out at 24 litres or 1 litre per hour. Okay. However, she is lactating. That's going to increase. Now, how much they drink will depend on how much milk they're producing as a rule of thumb, a foal or a calf or a lamb will drink 20% of their body weight daily. So if you go back to this foal, let's assume this foal is 50 kilos. So 10% of its body weight is going to be 5 litres, 20% of its body weight is going to be 10 litres. So this foal could potentially drink up to 10 litres of milk per day, which means the mare has to make that amount. So we're going to increase her water intake to well over 30 litres per day. I'd probably assume she was going to drink something in the region of 35 litres per day. And then if you think, well, okay, I'll give her a bucket. How much does a typical bucket hold? Depends on it. The standard bucket is about 20 litres. You'll have to refill the bucket at least twice a day in that instance, assuming either she or the foal knocks it over. So I suppose the take-home message is you need to have large containers for water, particularly for lactating animals, and it's important to check them regularly, at least twice a day, to make sure that they have access to water at all times. Okay, that was an overview of water supply for hospitalised patients. Normally in class I'd ask you for questions at this point. What I'm going to do for the next few weeks is to put a forum thread on Moodle. So if you have any questions that arise as you're watching these lectures, I'll ask you to post your question on the Moodle forum. That way then I can see the question and reply to it on the forum post as well, so everybody can see the answers. Because I kind of feel that if one of you asks a question, several other people are probably thinking the same thing. So rather than me replying to the same question individually on emails, I'll ask you to post your questions on a forum thread, and then I can reply to them there so that everybody can see the responses. Okay. I want to finish off this section by mentioning a few odds and ends. Bran is something you'll come across from time to time in large animal care, particularly in relation to horses. It was a traditional foodstuff. We see less and less of it being used nowadays. We just want to make you aware of it in case someone asks you to prepare a bran mash for a patient. So what is it? Bran is the husk of the wheat grain. So when we grow wheat, we harvest the seeds of the wheat to make flour for human consumption out of. The flour is the white endosperm in the middle of the husk. And outside that, there's these tough layers of bran, which are formed of complex carbohydrates. During the milling process, to make white flour, that husk is removed. So wholemeal flour, the husk is still in it. Those little brown flakes you see in wholemeal flour. Whereas white flour is the center of the wheat head or ear with the husk removed. And that husk, when it's removed, is known as bran. It's very indigestible, it's very low in nutrients because it contains pretty much just complex carbohydrates like lignin and so on. So it's kind of a byproduct of the milling industry. It was traditionally fed to horses as a mash. It was a cheap food source. It was fed to them traditionally on their day off. So say on the Sunday, if they weren't being worked, people would give them a low energy bran mash rather than a high energy concentrate feed such as oats. It adds bulk to the diet and it has a laxative effect. So it might give the animal slight diarrhea for a day or two. It was traditionally felt to be kind of good for horses, but now that we know a bit more about the equine microbiome and the importance of the microbial populations in the hindgut, we're less inclined to feed them bran mashes. There's less indication for it nowadays. That said, you might occasionally be asked to give it to a horse that the vet is worried they're getting an impaction, for example. So while it's not something we'll routinely feed, it is no harm to be aware of it. This is what it looks like. It's these kind of brown, light husks or flakes. Next time you're in Tesco in the bacon section, stop and pick up a bag of bran. You'll find it in the bacon section. Compare its weight to a bag of flour. It's a much lighter substance and it's got these little brown flakes in it. If you are asked to make a bran mash for a horse, you'll put about 1 kilo of bran into the bottom of a clean bucket. Then bring a kettle to a boil and add enough boiling water to barely wet it. So this is important. If you make it too wet, the animal won't eat it. So you want to just damp it enough to make the bran stick together. Just a splash of boiling water from the kettle is normally enough to do it. So add a little bit, mix it well with a stick. Don't put your hands in there because it's really, really hot. And mix it up until you get a kind of a damp, crumbly texture to it. If in doubt, add a bit more water. But once you've put it in, you can't take it out, obviously. So err on the side of caution initially. Bran is a good insulator, so it will stay hot for a while. You don't feed it straight away. You cover the bucket with a cloth and leave it to cool down until it's just warm. Now, a mash isn't very palatable. A lot of horses aren't that keen on it. So you can add some concentrate feed or sliced apples or carrots to get the horse to eat it more easily. And then once it's ready, you put it into the horse's feed manger or container And then my advice is rinse the bucket immediately, because if the bran dries onto it, it sticks like mad and it's really hard to get it off. So anything that had damp bran on it, like the stick or the bucket, give it a good wash once you're finished, to avoid you coming back tomorrow and finding it stuck on and you have to try and scrub it off, which takes ages. So that's how to make a bran mash. As I say, it's not something you'll routinely do, but you'll occasionally might be asked to make it. So it's just to make you aware of it. Right, I'm going to finish off this section by giving you a little sample exam question to do. So let's say I asked you to compare and contrast hay and silage. So they're both types of feed for hospitalized large animals. And the question might be, say, for 6 marks, to compare and contrast hay and silage. So before maybe you could pause the video here now, have a go at that, see can you come up with some comparisons and some contrasts, and then come back and we'll have a look at what you came up with. So if we move on to comparisons, first of all, we're asking you, how are they both the same? So you have to refer to both hay and silage in your answer as you compare them. So here's some examples. Both hay and silage are methods of preserving grass for use in the winter to feed animals when they're hospitalized or kept indoors. They can be used to keep animals going during the Irish winter when the grass isn't growing. And they're both sources of dietary roughage. So you can see here my comparisons, each one refers to both hay and silage. So I'm making it clear what the comparisons are between the two. There's obviously other comparisons you could come up with as well. So once they're accurate, that's fine. If we move on then to contrast, I'm asking you, how are they different? So I want to know some examples of ways in which they differ. So here we go, here's some examples. First of all, hay is made by drying grass, where silage is made by fermenting grass. So again, my contrast is referring to both substances, but this time I'm explaining how they're different. Another example, we cut silage before the grass flowers, so it's usually late April into May, whereas hay is cut after the grass has flowered or gone to seed, which is usually June or July in this part of the world. Hay has a much higher dry matter content than silage. So hay contains much less moisture than silage because it's been made by drying it. So they're just some examples. Another one, we can say that silage is less dependent on the weather conditions than hay. So that's a reason why it's widely used in Ireland, because we tend to get a lot of wet weather at the time of the year when we want to dry grass for hay. So they're just some contrasts. Again, you can see each one is referring to both hay and silage. I'm not describing hay or silage separately, because that's not what the question asked. Okay, so that's just an example of type of exam question you might encounter and how to think about having a go at it as part of your revision. If you want some more information on feeding large animals, the Teagasc manuals in the DKT library are very good. McKernan's clinical textbook for veterinary technicians is helpful. For online resources, the Merck Veterinary Manual is useful. So if you go to merckvetmanual.com, you'll find some resources there. And if you want specific advice on feeding horses, the Manual of Horsemanship is in the DKT library. If you want specific advice on feeding hospitalized animals, you can look at the Equine Hospital Manual by Corley and Stephen. And again, that's available from the DKT library as an ebook, so you don't have to physically go into the library to read it. Okay, I'm going to leave it there for this session. Thanks very much. And if you have any questions on this, as I say, I'll be making a thread available on a Moodle forum for you to ask them. Thanks very much and all the best.